my pleasure to introduce to you Matt Wiesaw, who is the Executive Director of the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. The Department of Civil Rights is co-hosting our conference with us today. We're very grateful for their involvement, and we're looking forward to Mr. Wiesaw's comments.
I really do appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak to you. This is back home for me. I was born and raised just west of here in a small town called Bangor. Been here many times, so this is going to be great. After the conference, I'm actually going to go a little farther west and visit my dad. So I appreciate the opportunity. You know, our department is proud to be a partner with the Fair Housing Center of Southwestern Michigan to bring you the 11th Annual Fair Housing Conference, one of the premier fair housing events in the Midwest. We look forward to learning along with you about ways to make our housing, transportation, and public space more accessible for all. And we'll be learning from the best. We're fortunate to have Rosemary Rossetti, Dr. Rossetti of the Universal Design Living Laboratory, HUD's Sarah Pratt, and all the other expert panelists that have agreed to share what they've learned in their decades of experience improving the lives of countless individuals. But beyond our special guests, I want to take a moment to shine a bright light on Bob Ellis and his staff. First thing Bob said to me this morning when we met was, it's 9 months until summer. That made an impact. That's thinking. That's looking to the future. It is 42 degrees out, but for those of us who have lived in Michigan all of our lives, this is what we love. This is great. But it's without Bob and his Fair Center housing staff that, and their tireless efforts day to day, month in and year out, of southwestern Michigan would be a much less welcoming and inclusive place to live. It's refreshing when we have the opportunity to help bring about positive change on the front end of this process. The Michigan Department of Civil Rights is most often on the other end of the equation, investigating and resolving complaints related to housing discrimination and inaccessibility. We thank you for affording us the opportunity, this important opportunity. When all of us work together to ensure everyone has access to barrier-free housing and accommodations, the impact isn't confined to individuals with accessibility needs. The entire community benefits when all residents can be happy and productive where they live, where they work, and where they play. We hope what we learn here today will help transform Southwest Michigan communities into models of diversity and livability and improve the quality of life for all who call this beautiful area home. So again, thank you for the invitation. I look forward to a very great conference. And again, thanks to all of the experts who have come to participate. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. That's very good, but you could do better. So I'm really happy to be here. I've taken a long and winding road from Washington, D.C. I forget when I started back in Washington. Let me see. It was last Thursday morning. I was in Washington, and then I went from Washington to Chicago. Hi, Allison. And was in Chicago for 2 days of conferences. I went home for about 30 seconds, got on a plane the next day and went to Providence Town, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where I've been for the last 2 days, and I arrived here at Kalamazoo last night. So I've been on the road quite a bit in the last few days. I'm very happy to be here. You know, President Obama and my new Secretary of HUD, Julian Castro, you may have heard of one or both of them previously, have now said, and praise be to them, have now said that HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, is now the Department of Opportunity. As someone who works for the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, I was pleased to hear that. But I will say that I think their ideas about opportunity are a good bit broader than just the typical sort of old school fair housing law, you know, civil rights law. It's more about the broader picture. And today's workshops and sessions are going to be about the broader picture. They're going to be about some of the innovations and some of the bigger thinking that we've been doing. And in particular today, we're focusing on the bigger thinking around people with disabilities. I come prepared for this discussion. My career in civil rights has been, unfortunately, quite long. I'm a kind of person who finds something and sticks with it. So 38 years in fair housing work. But I cut my teeth on the issues we're talking about today when I married a guy named Charlie Pratt in 1982. Charlie and I went to school together. I got my law degree, and Charlie got his master's degree in urban planning. So we went to classes together. We had lots of conversations about what disability issues had to do with the community. Oh, did I not mention? Charlie used a wheelchair for transportation. And so he had his urban planning degree and looked at the issues around community access from a disability perspective. And of course, because we were married, so did I. And we both looked at all of those issues from a civil rights perspective as well. And so this was a long time ago, and Charlie was a city planner for the city of Louisville, Kentucky, when he died. But those lessons we learned early together in life have sort of been a profound motivator for me in the work that I do. So that's really all you need to know about me. HUD, Department of Opportunity, and having had life experience working in the areas that we're going to be talking about today. So they gave me a title. It was thought leader. I've never been a thought leader before. So I'm going to call on everybody in this group to be with me in this assignment and in this task. Because, you know, it's not just in a good conference, it's not just the people up here who are inspiring you and talking to you. It's your thoughts too. Where do you go with these ideas? How do you incorporate them in what you're doing? And how do you incorporate the ideas about disability inclusion across a community? Not just in your little neck of the woods, but in a broader scope, in a broader picture. Like all civil rights issues, disability rights are about inclusion. It's about opportunity. Indeed, it is about opportunity. It is about the way in which we bring people together to think in important ways about increased inclusion, lack of segregation, great opportunities. What are the ways in which people with disabilities live now? And are there ways to expand those opportunities? Right? Look at you. So that's some of the things we're going to be talking about this morning. So I come from this perspective, both from HUD, that provides housing and funds housing and supports housing and works with housers all over the country, everywhere from tax credit agencies to housing for homeless people, housing for people with mental and physical disabilities, and general forms of affordable housing. So you take that big lump of opportunity, and then today's session is going to focus on how we drill those ideas down into Kalamazoo, right? So that's the picture that we're looking at. That's the grandiose set of themes for today. But we have the capacity to do that. I look around this group and I see and imagine and have been told we have people here from the real estate industry, the property management industry, right? From the advocacy community, from the community leadership itself, and from the civil rights community. And I apologize if I've left any of you out. You'll be sure and tell us later on if you represent a different sector of the community that is at this big set of tables trying to figure out where we go with our ideas about civil rights for people with disabilities and how we take all of those ideas to the community. That's what we're going to do this morning and through lunch. So I come at this first and foremost from the Fair Housing Act. And the Fair Housing Act really does and always has focused on rights of individuals, at least in the thou shalt nots. The thou shalt nots part of the law is, you know, the things that pull out of the law that say there are certain rights afforded to people with disabilities, right, because they have a disability, right? There's a causal connection. Disability, housing-related need, because of, right? We're going to talk about that in the panel this morning, and I've been told I'm free to interrupt or add thoughts or extract further ideas from folks, right? So we're going to do some of that this morning. We're going to talk about those individual rights. What this will not be will be some black letter law, reasonable accommodation, service animals, parking, spaces, blah, blah, unless you have a need to talk about those things. It'll be a little bit broader than that, I imagine. So the rights for people with disabilities have required us in some ways to throw out our old and conventional ideas about civil rights and how they apply. Because many of us went through trainings. I see someone right here in the room. I know I trained in 1979. Trainings over and over again. Don't discriminate. Treat everybody the same. But the first and foremost piece about treating everyone the same when it comes to disability is you throw that part out of the window and you think about serving the needs of the individual, meeting the needs of the individual. People with disabilities come in all flavors. They come in, some with physical disability needs for accessibility, some for mental disability needs or cognitive disability needs. They come with all kinds of concerns and issues. And looking at each individual, the law says, is a core component of how we serve people with disabilities, specifically in the housing market for the purposes of the thou shalt nots in the law. So, and if there's federal funding involved in that housing, the rights may be stronger and have more protection, right? So we have other civil rights laws besides the Fair Housing Act that say, oh my gosh, if you live in public housing or HUD-assisted housing or even in rural housing funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, okay, rural rental housing, anyone know about that? Yeah? The rights may be stronger because the federal funding string provides more protection, okay? So we're going to talk about how those individual rights intersect with the law and how we go about meeting those needs. I noticed in the packet of materials a notice that my staff wrote on the rights of people with disabilities to the reasonable accommodation of a service animal. That is relatively new guidance, and we put it down all in one place because when we went to conferences like this, the first 18 questions people ask us about were service animals, companion animals, therapy animals, and every horror story that people had ever experienced or in one way or another about that particular kind of reasonable accommodation. So we have the reasonable accommodation parts of the law, we have the structural modification parts of the law, and we have the physical accessibility parts of the Fair Housing Act, the parts that say when you're building new housing you have to make it accessible. Those parts of the law were made and constructed differently than the general parts of the law of thou shalt not discriminate. Those parts of the law say reach out and do something affirmative for individuals to address the rights and the needs of individual people. Okay? But that part of the law is still very individual-oriented, very much oriented towards the individual needs of the individual people with their own forms of disabilities. Then there's this next concept, another civil rights law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, especially Title II. Now, that law applies to the operations of states and cities and counties and public entities. So it doesn't apply to a private property management company, not directly, but it does apply to the operations of public entities. And we're going to hear some discussion today about this new vibrancy given to us by a Supreme Court decision in 1999 and a reinvention of it by the United States Department of Justice in dealing with people with disabilities who are institutionalized and what their rights are to leave that institutional setting and move into the community. Because people with disabilities who live in institutions often have very severe forms of disabilities, there often are services needed by those individuals as well as housing. And Allison and others will tell you today about how we set that up in a community, how we think about it in a community, and also sort of what the parameters are about that from a national perspective, from the point of view of the Department of Justice and statewide plans. A lot of this is not so much about changing HUD programs or any existing program as it is driving where individuals get placed in the community coming out of institutions, and a broader context that is a more integrative model for people with disabilities. See, I can talk about this one. I spent the first 2 years of married life at the ripe old age of 23, living in HUD-funded housing with a bunch of seniors. Now, if you're 23 and living in housing with a bunch of seniors and you're still on your honeymoon, I'm just going to say that's a challenging experience. It was not one I would have undertaken voluntarily. I mean, we were the ones hanging out by the pool with beers in our hands, and everybody else was looking out their windows at us, seeing what we were going to do next, right? Why did we live in that? Why did we choose that? Well, we were poor. We were in school. But that wasn't the only reason. The real reason was that's the only place we could find an accessible unit to live in. It was HUD-funded housing. Because the private market didn't have anything for us. This was a few years ago now. The private market didn't offer us anything. Even if we could have afforded it, there was no place to live. We lived in, and after that in Louisville, we lived in an apartment we had to structurally change ourselves to make it usable by us. Because again, the private market, we were worth working then. We had money. But we couldn't find a place that had an accessible unit in it that we could live in. So we had to make structural changes to a unit to live in the community we wanted to live in. Right? Later on, when we bought a house, moving up, we hired an architect to design a ramp for the front porch. It was an older house, and it was very accessible on the inside. Wide doors, those old-style wide doors, big bathrooms. Any of you remember big bathrooms? Most of us grew up in 50s houses that had those tiny little bathrooms, with the black and white tiles on the floor. Well, this was older than that, and it had a really gigantous bathroom, which was all great, but the house was up a bit. And so we had to hire an architect to design a ramp to get in and out of the building. We were the talk of the neighborhood then, too. But the point is, we chose to live our lives the way, as much as we could, the way anyone of our age and salary ranges and interests would have lived. But I have to tell you, it was a hard task. It's a hard task for us. So now we've talked about the rights that have come along and the civil rights laws that protect individuals. We have the Fair Housing Act, the Thou Shalt Nots or Thou Shall offer reasonable accommodations, modifications, and structural accessibility in new construction. We've talked about Olmstead, which is really about providing the most integrated setting appropriate for each individual. Right? We're going to talk about that a lot this morning. The third part of what we're going to talk about this morning is about the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, which includes not just the obligation not to discriminate, which is all around us, and you've heard a million trainings. We're going to talk about some of that today. And not just this kind of newer interpretation of ADA Title II about giving people with disabilities the opportunities to live in the most integrated setting that they want to live in. The obligation to affirmatively further fair housing takes on various categories of people and looks at them in a more universal way across a community or a state or even a country, and says, how do we take down old barriers globally? How do we open communities up? How do we make this community a community of opportunity for people with disabilities? And that's a more global picture, isn't it? I know it's about transportation and linkages. I know it's about where housing is located for people with disabilities. And is it in the places that will meet the needs of a variety of different types of people with disabilities? I know it's about access to services and amenities. I know it's about patterns of segregation and creation of opportunities and thinking about what opportunity is like if you're a 34-year-old professional with a disability. If you're a mom with 3 kids, the 12-year-old has a disability. What's that opportunity look like? What does it look like if you're raising up towards a senior life or you're already a senior? And what is opportunity for you like in that setting? And what should it look like in a different way to create access for you, for the things you want to do? So the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing is this broader scope thing that says, in my community, where are the barriers? how do we open them up? And I know we're going to hear some things about that today, positive things that are bubbling up in Kalamazoo. And I think from my limited conversations this morning, part of the whole purpose of this event today is to bring all those pieces together. All those pieces together. And think about opportunity for individuals and opportunities across a community. So those are my thoughts.
Feel free to, as Sarah said, relax, roll up your sleeves, and let's get ready to talk about how we can make our community better. My name is Allison Bethel, and as Sarah said, I am the director of the Fair Housing Legal Clinic at John Marshall Law School. I am an attorney, and I came to fair housing actually around 1988-89 when the Fair Housing Amendments Act was being passed. At that time, I was with a private firm, and I was practicing in Florida, and a lot of our clients were concerned about the Amendments Act and how it would apply to them and their status as senior communities. And I share this with you so that you understand that I bring a background of, frankly, having started in this arena in working with housing providers. We represented a lot of homeowner and condominium associations as well as property management companies. And so I do bring a sensitivity and an understanding of some of the issues that and problems that housing providers face. I did that for about 6 or 7 years, and then I moved to the Attorney General's office where I became the Director of Civil Rights, and in that capacity I enforced the civil rights laws on behalf of the state. And that also gave me what I think is a somewhat unique perspective in looking at government's role and in this arena, and particularly although Sarah comes from the federal perspective, there is a lot that states can bring to this issue, and indeed, in my view, in any way, a lot of these are uniquely state issues, state and local government issues. They are in many ways in the best position to know what's going on in their communities and how to address that. And I did that for, again, 6 or 7 years, which seems to be, I don't know, a number in my life, 6 or 7 years, because now I've been at John Marshall for 6 years doing fair housing work with young law students. And we, in addition to teaching the doctrinal piece, we actually represent victims of housing discrimination. We represent them in state court and in federal court, as well as the various local venues that are available. So it's with this background that I hope that we can have today a good conversation of how we can bring the mandates of the Fair Housing Act as well as the Olmstead decision into the community on the ground and really make a difference in people's lives. One thing, we've been talking about the Olmstead decision, but I just want to make a couple points about it, maybe that just so that we're on the same page. It was a decision in 1999 that actually was not under the Fair Housing Act. It was under the ADA, and it dealt with folks with mental disabilities. And in essence, the Supreme Court said that over-institutionalization of folks with disabilities is a form of discrimination. So it is discrimination to segregate people with disabilities in these kinds of institutional settings, and what we need to do is to move them out to the most integrated community-based setting that is appropriate for them. And what is appropriate for them is going to vary per individual and, what their circumstances are. That is a huge huge charge. And in order to do that, we are going to need really the strategies, of combination of strategies that we're going to talk about today, both in terms of housing, employment, transportation, and all of these different things. One of the, I have some materials out front that really give you just sort of kind of an overview from the fair housing perspective of some of the protections. But what I wanted to focus my remarks on today, and what I was asked to talk about today, are some of the problems actually that I see in implementing the reasonable accommodations and modification provisions of the Fair Housing Act. And one of the reasons this is so important is that to realize Olmstead, we are going to need, as I said, a combination of strategies. It involves the building of new housing, which David's going to talk about. It's going to involve advocacy. It is also going to involve the need to work with our existing housing, existing multifamily housing, in a way that allows people to live there and live there productively. And one of the ways we're going to do that is through these reasonable accommodations and modifications. And I know I'm not supposed to, Sarah says we're not supposed to talk a lot about service animals, but I have got to mention this because for some reason, this is an area that continues to be heavily litigated. And so there is confusion about this. There is confusion about what is the responsibility, what are the rights of service animals, and so forth. So I just want to throw that out there. First of all, there is a difference in the ADA and under the Fair Housing Act as far as service animals go. And on the Fair Housing Act interpretation is much, much broader. Okay, it allows folks to have animals that are assistance animals, that are therapy animals, emotional support animals. A lot of these terms are bandied about, but the essence is these animals do not have to be specially trained, as you might be used to hearing about with seeing eye dogs and hearing dogs and these other things. These can just be dogs or other animals. I use the term dogs, but again, it is much broader under the Fair Housing Act that provide an emotional support to people. Yet this continues to be an area where property providers, landlords seem to be confused about. There are many cases where property providers continue to charge fees. Well, first of all, continue to refuse people who have these animals, charge fees for them, require increased or require documentation beyond what is required by the Act for these animals. And as difficult as it is for property providers to accept, in essence, if you have a no pet rule, it must yield. It must be modified to accommodate people with disabilities who need these kinds of animals. Okay? That doesn't mean that you cannot enact restrictions concerning some usage of them in terms of picking up after them and these kinds of things, but you must allow them. Breed and size limitations? No, you can't do it. Okay? If for some reason, if the animal poses a threat to the community and this threat issue needs to be established by objective evidence, then you can do something about it. Then you may be able to work something out with the person, and you may be able to exclude the animal. But for the most part, you cannot evict a tenant, you cannot refuse a person, and you have to allow these animals.
Can you charge a fee? For as a deposit, a pet deposit?
No, no, no. These are not considered pets, and I do commend to your reading. I think I saw it on the Fair Housing Table as well as out in the front, the guidance that HUD issued on this. It is really quite good. It is really written in a very easy to read format to give you to give you some understanding of what the law has said about this. And I will say that there are a lot of people that feel that the law has evolved in a way that is very troublesome for property providers. These animals are not necessarily limited to dogs. I think the oddest one that I saw was in a therapy kangaroo. You can Google that if you want. I mean, I'm not gonna, but it isn't limited to dogs and cats, which is what you might think. There may even be circumstances where you have to allow more than one. Okay, I had a case like that, and again, all of these turn on the individual circumstances of the person. The point that I want to make to you is that you've really got to open your mind. You've got to refine your policies, as difficult and I will say, there indeed is going to be some education perhaps in this and some of the other issues that I'm going to talk about that you're going to need to engage in with other residents and tenants so that they understand what you're doing and why you're doing. But these kinds of things are important. Again, bringing it back to Olmsted. Why? Because in order for people with disabilities to live in these types of settings, in private housing, which some of them can, you have to yield these policies. Another area that seems to be very problematic for housing providers is the whole process of requesting a reasonable accommodation or modification. And let me back up. Accommodation is a change in your policy. Modification is a change in the structure. The request, there's no magic words. Okay, it doesn't have to be in writing. It may be orally, and it doesn't have to be formal. So if someone says, "Can you help me out with this?" or it may even be by implication. Okay, it doesn't have to be anything formal. So get that in your head and understand that, because a lot of housing providers run into problems with that. The medical backup issue. Okay, don't get too detailed on that. Don't stand on too much ceremony. It doesn't have to be from an MD. It can be from a therapist or someone with a lesser medical licensure. It just really needs to be credible. It needs to be, yes, from someone with some sort of a medical understanding of the person's condition, and it needs to have, it needs to tie the requested accommodation into the person's disability. There's another thing called the interactive process. How many people have heard of that before? I'd like to see more hands on that. Really would like to see more hands on that. This is an area, this is a problem, okay? The interactive process is a fancy word for let's talk. We need to have a conversation about it. There should really be no accommodation where the answer is no, okay? Because the law requires you to engage in a dialogue with the person requesting the accommodation, so that if what they are requesting isn't something that you can provide, that you talk about what else might be done to accommodate, ameliorate the situation. You don't just say no You talk about it. So the interactive process is designed so that the conversation ends with maybe not the accommodation that the person requested, but something else that will work for them. Generally, the person is entitled to the accommodation that they request. But if it's going to create an undue administrative burden, administrative or financial burden for the housing provider, you don't have to provide that one. But through this conversation, the idea is that you reach something that will work for them. Another area that we see a lot of difficulty with is working with folks with mental disabilities, okay? Someone who has a mental disability and may engage in odd or annoying behavior, that's not necessarily illegal. Okay, so just because the behavior is odd or illegal doesn't mean you can odd or annoying doesn't mean that you can evict them or refuse them occupancy to live in your apartment. You need to really look at what the conduct is. Okay, and it may indeed, again, just be annoying and you have to allow it. We had a case where a gentleman with a disability would wipe the threshold of his door with it was kind of I don't know I can't recall the name of it, but it was kind of a thing where through using, cleaning the threshold with ammonia and other things, this made him believe that the place was cleaner, and for some reason he did this. It annoyed a lot of people. No one had an allergy. No one got any sickness about it. It was just annoying. And they were trying to evict him because of this. This is not the kind of conduct that the law allows you to evict someone from. If it is creating a threat to other people, to the health, safety, and welfare of the community, then you can. But just because you're annoyed with the behavior isn't going to cut it. We see it also a lot with noise complaints. And noise complaints, I mean, we could talk for a long time about noise complaints. A lot of times if you have an autistic person or child in the home, there may be some noise issues. And again, if it reaches the level where it really is impairing the health, safety, and welfare of the community. And again, you need to definitely document that. But otherwise, just noise, and particularly noise that is not occurring at I don't know, 2 o'clock in the morning, and maybe even some that's occurring in 2 o'clock in the morning that you have to, you may have to tolerate, depending on the level of the noise. But these are the kinds of behaviors that I just want to suggest to you. You need to work with the people, the residents who are having the issues, as well as the people who are in the community, to make them understand that we have to accommodate some of these things in the interest of integration under the requirements of Olmstead.
Allison? Thank you.
So today I was asked to talk a little bit about what are some of those barriers in the community that can frequently get in the way. What are some of the myths that we all tend to believe about disability and about barriers that prevent people with disabilities from being a true part of our community? So I'm going to talk about some of these, and feel free to stop me if there are questions or comments. So one of the first things that we often hear is people with disabilities don't come here. We don't need to be accessible because we've never had a person come in here. One of the first times I heard this, I was meeting with a local college about becoming more accessible and inclusive. And as I climbed up their flights of steps over their rolling campus, they said, "Gosh, we've never had a wheelchair user here." And I said, "Well, maybe that's because there's not a single ramp on the entire campus." Also, 80 to 94% of disabilities are invisible. So my response to that is yes. You probably do have people with disabilities come there. You just don't know it. People with disabilities, as we all know, I'm preaching to the choir here, are in every part of our community, in every role, and at every level of leadership. And so people with disabilities are here, and one of the best things we can do to make our world work better for everyone is to be as accessible as we can. Another myth that we often hear is we're grandfathered in. As we've talked about earlier this summer, there is no grandfather clause in the ADA. None. Organizations are always required to plan for access and inclusion and do what's called readily achievable barrier removal, which basically means plan for access and inclusion. And if you have questions on how to become more accessible and inclusive, or how to make a plan that can support your organization in being more open to people with disabilities, you can always call Disability Network. But as our first speaker said, the response to not being accessible is never, "Oh, sorry, no, we're done." So parking, it's a common area with a lot of myths. And one of the reasons I included in the presentation, we often think of parking as ancillary. But if somebody can't park, they can't get inside a building. They can't even begin to go to a place if there's no way for them to get there. So we'll go to a place and they'll say, "But we've got blue paint down there." Well, parking is a little more complex than that. Accessible parking includes an access aisle, it includes signage. There are lots of different parts and pieces to access than what we think we see. So again, I'd encourage you to take a look at the businesses and the places that you go to. And even if you think your parking is okay, it's all right to give us a call and say, "I'd really like to check this out. Is this parking compliant with the current standards? Is this actually going to meet someone's need?" Because having parking, having blue paint down there, doesn't magically make a parking spot accessible. It doesn't magically help it meet someone's needs. Also, you should know that if you want to be on the leading edge of access, there's a new accessible icon for parking. It's a more active, I don't know what's going on. It's a more active icon for access that shows a person who's actually moving instead of just sitting there, because all of us are moving throughout the community. Yes, as we mentioned, only 9 months until summer. So while we're all waiting for summer, it's great when people clear their snow. It really warms my heart when I see a shoveled sidewalk, or I can get into a building and have it be, salted and nice. But when people pile the snow in the nice accessible spot because it's big and it's flat and there's so much room there, that makes it not accessible anymore. And the reason it's big and flat and there's so much room there is because people need the room. So yes, definitely shovel your snow. Please don't put it in the accessible spots. And if you'd like to see a photo of what the new active icon looks like, my coworker Michelle McGowan helpfully brought one. Yes, it's very impressive, right? And Disability Network can help you get connected to the signs and stickers you'd need to update your parking lot. So we'll often go into a building and we'll say, we'd like to take a look at your bathrooms and just make sure they're accessible so that the people that we serve can use them. For instance, if we're holding a meeting or something. And they'll say, "Oh yeah, it's accessible. We have the bars." That's good. Bars are good. It's helpful to have a grab bar. But there's, again, a lot of other aspects of accessibility that are part of that. And one of them includes having space for a wheelchair to actually go into the stall. So it's pretty easy to see that the picture on the top right isn't accessible because there's nowhere for a wheelchair to go. What about the photo on the bottom left? Does that look accessible? What could be done to make it more accessible? This is the part where you talk. Anyone see that tiny little footstool hidden in the corner? So that is what I've come to think of as the not so great garbage can spot. I often go into accessible stalls and people are like, great, lots of room. I'm going to stick my garbage can there. That's not going to work because then it takes away the room that someone who uses a chair would need for that access. So I'm appointing all of you to be secret access ninjas. When you see garbage cans in the accessible stall, move them. And then tell management what you did. So, looking at access again from a broader perspective, something that we see in a lot of organizations is we'll hear of organizations in the community and systems and people saying, I'm sorry, we don't do that. You'll have to go find assistance with that. One example might be if someone says, oh, I can't read that form to you. I don't have time. I'm sorry you don't understand it. Maybe you can find a friend. Or, gosh, I know that that's not accessible to you and you need it electronically, but I don't know how to do that. Maybe call Disability Network and they can help you. Now, we are certainly happy to help people with access and inclusion, but it is the business owner's responsibility and the community's responsibility to make services accessible for people. And so when you do this, there are two benefits. One, if you're looking at how to make your services accessible and get things in alternate format, it's accessible for people with disabilities. Two, when you need that document in electronic format because you've got to send it to your colleague for a presentation, it's already done. So when you have things in multiple formats, you can make your business and your community work better for everyone. So I'd just like to take a short commercial break here to say that you can create access without ripping down walls and moving everything, although that's really nice if you do. You can do what are called program accommodations, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. You can move items, like if you have a soap dispenser that's very high up, you can put a little bar of soap down by the sink. If you have a drinking fountain that's not accessible, you can put Dixie cups by the drinking fountain so that someone who uses a wheelchair can access it. So there are lots of smaller, thoughtful ways that we can create access in our communities while we're working on making our buildings and our communities completely accessible. And again, it's easy to think about physical access, but I also encourage everyone to think about access for people with mental health disabilities and intellectual disabilities. For instance, if I have a large waiting room that everybody has to wait in before they get to see one of our staff, and I have someone come up to me and say, I have a lot of anxiety, and it's really hard for me to wait in this large waiting room with all of these people. Do I have a way of saying, oh yeah, let me show you to a smaller conference room where you can take a seat before we get started? Or if someone says, I haven't been in this building before and I really feel like I need to know my way around, can you show me? Does your organization have policies and practices in place of supporting people to be able to access your services? And again, access is sometimes more about policies than it is about things. I would say having flexible policies is one of the most critical aspects to access. Because as we're going to talk about a lot today, and as all of you know, every one of us is a different human being. This doesn't shock anybody. People with disabilities, all different human beings, different needs, different accommodations. And so having a flexible policy says, we're going to work with you so that things can work best for you. And we're going to make sure that however you need to access our services, we can help you do that. That might be a tweak in our policy. It might be a change in the way we do things. And that's okay. If I usually meet with somebody for an hour to go through their housing application, and they say, an hour would really burn me out. I can't focus for a whole hour, and because of my disability, is there a way that we can meet on 2 separate days for 2 meetings so I can go through this application? Having that in place to say, we can be flexible. Even though our policy says we meet with everybody one time to go over their housing application, let's be flexible in that policy and meet with you twice. So when I talk about flexibility, people will often say, but people will take advantage of us. We'll have everybody requesting flexibility all the time. We'll have to gut our entire building and redo everything to make it fully accessible. We'll have to change everything we do and we'll never be able to get our work done. Well, that's not been my experience. My experience is that people want to transact business in the quickest, most efficient way possible. And usually that's going to require small tweaks and small ways of doing things versus large-scale change. Are there a few people who might take advantage of flexible policies or access in a system? Sure. But do we really want to build our entire system to cater to those few people who might take advantage while denying true access to the rest of us, to all of us who could benefit from these modes of accessibility and these ways of being in our community? So when people say, how do I become accessible? I'm sure most of you have heard about transition plans and about creating access in a way that's thoughtful. A lot of people create transition plans and then they don't put any money towards them. So one tip I often give to organizations is you also want to fund your transition plan. Money for accommodations should be in your budget. It can be a line item, so that if someone requests an interpreter, it's not a giant surprise and a scramble for funds. It's already there. Or if you find that you need to change out a workstation so that one of your employees can be more productive, that's not a huge deal because you've already got the money. Or if you know that you want to update your bathroom because you've got the bars but you don't have the space, then hey, maybe you can build in $100 a month for the next 4 years, and then you'll have the money. So thinking about access is great. Planning for it is better. Budgeting for it is really what's going to help it to happen. Also, we often have in the community, we have this way of being that says, well, I just need to look at what my organization can do and do that little bit. And that's really good. It's good to look at what you can do and what's feasible for your organization. What might be even better is to look at what will it take for us to be as accessible and inclusive to as many people as possible. What will it take for us to provide the best service, to have the most accessible housing, to be the premier housing destination in Kalamazoo County? And start there. If you can think of what will it take to do what we need to do, then you can have that plan in place, and when the opportunities arise, you'll be positioned. You'll say, well, gosh, you know, there was a federal grant for creating more accessible housing, and we already have this plan in place to do that. So positioning yourself for access is also really important. And finally, I just want to reiterate that access really does work better for everybody. We often think of ramps as being useful for people in wheelchairs. They're also useful for people who use strollers, people who have luggage, people who don't like climbing stairs. I once heard a story of a young boy who was getting ready to go into a school after a snowfall. Sorry to say the S word. And he was waiting for the janitor to clear the ramp. And he said, oh, could you clear that ramp? And the janitor said, oh, yeah, you know, I just need to clear the stairs first because, you know, people use the stairs, you use the ramp. And he said, but if you clear the ramp, everybody can get in.
I first want to say I love what I do. And I'm encouraged because I'm in a room of people that feel that same sentiment, I believe. And the energy from that. Matter of fact, how many of you heard the butterfly effect, that concept? Just a few of you? Is it really true that a butterfly flapping its wings in New York can change the weather in Tokyo? If you really truly believe that, the smallest bit of change can have tremendous effect. So I want you to go through today just keeping that concept in your mind. My background, I started architectural school right out of high school. The first house I designed was in Lansing, but the last one I did was in Japan. I spent 3 months over in Japan and designed a house over there. I speak Japanese. and worked with an architect, and it was a great experience. Looked at a different culture and a different world in a sense, and that's really what we're talking about here, is just getting people to understand that there's a different world out there and look at things from a different perspective. My bachelor's is from Spring Arbor University in business and organizational development, but really what my passion was, working in Kalamazoo, somebody asked me, he says, David, do you love what you do? And I really had to say no. And I had just prayed for purpose in my life. And he goes, well, you're pretty handy. Why don't you do your own thing? I said, Phil, everybody would if they knew what to do. He goes, oh, you got to do this. He goes, you're pretty handy. He says, there's a growing population of seniors and people with disabilities that want to live in their own home, and they don't know who to call and trust. The next day, I started my own business here in Kalamazoo called Leeward Group. We did property maintenance for seniors and people with disabilities. And they would call me for the craziest things because they knew that they could trust me. I had a lady that couldn't go down the steps, so I would go there every Wednesday and clean her kitty litter box out. She had 12 cats. And so every Wednesday for 2 years, I cleaned her kitty litter until she died. And she had a chance to say goodbye. But that's, you meet the people at their needs. She didn't need anything else. She just needed somebody to take care of her cats because she couldn't go up and down steps anymore. So 10 years passed. Matter of fact, at the same time I started my company, I helped start and a founding board member for Lending Hands. They lend out medical equipment for free here in Kalamazoo County and 8 surrounding counties. So if you're not familiar with that nonprofit, see me afterwards as well, because that's an amazing organization. So 10 years pass. I'm taking care of 200 houses here in Kalamazoo, myself and 3 other people, and it just became overwhelming. So I moved my company over into Pennings, and walking into this organization and talking to their handymen and talking to their builders and talking to the staff, I'm like, Brian, where'd you find these people? They're amazing people. And when you look at hiring, you hire people skills and you train them to do tasks, hammers, desk work, whatever your company does. And so as a builder going into homes, that's what people look for. They look for people that they can trust. They want to feel comfortable. They want to feel safe. And that's a key element with what I do. Matter of fact, there's a couple of examples I want to share with you. But as far as the ADA, I just want to make that blanket statement that it doesn't apply to single-family residents. And there's a lot of people that say it has to comply to ADA guidelines. Well, no, it doesn't. It'd be nice if we looked at those and incorporated some of them in there, but they don't have to comply. It's not that stringent. Matter of fact, this in design, in ADA, it's a matter of inches. So if you go into a home, and there's people that I work with that are taller than me and shorter than me, and where does that grab bar go? Well, it's not going to go where it's comfortable for me, which is the ADA requirement. We put it where it's comfortable for the homeowner so that she can use it so that it's more accessible for her. And it's a matter of inches of making that compliant or just good design. Matter of fact, there's a difference between accessibility design and universal design. And I don't want to steal any of Dr. Rossetti's thunder, but the difference in the designs is accessible design, you can see it. The ramp in the front of the house is visual. Universal design, you don't see it. The sidewalk is tapered and sloped up to the front of the house with no handrails or no railing because it's not more than 30 inches. And it's a gradual sloping sidewalk to the front of the house, so it's a no-step entry. That's universal design, functional for anybody and everybody. Joanne mentioned it. That same home, if you have a mother with a small child and she's out for a walk with a stroller, she can bring that stroller into the house without picking up the stroller or picking up the child. She can roll it in the house and the child sleeps for maybe 20 more minutes. Wouldn't every mother love 20 more minutes? Right? Well, guess what? That's just good design. if the gentleman travels and he's got a piece of luggage and he wheels it into the house without having to pick it up, that's just good design. We're not talking about wheelchairs. We're just talking about good design. And that's the difference you're going to see between accessible and universal. Accessible, you can see it. It's visual. It's a grab bar. It's all these different elements, all these different products. Universal design is just good design. Visitability is another term you're going to be familiar with, and we'll talk about. If you have a home that your grandparents can come and visit you in because there isn't a main floor bathroom and there's 5 steps to get into the house and they can't visit you, visitability is going to be another trend that you're going to start to see. I'm a builder, and I don't want to beat up on builders, but they've got to take some beating up because they've missed it over the years because they're building houses for cost as opposed to function. In architectural school, form follows function. You get out into the real world and form follows finance. There's a disconnect. And so we've got to get back to thinking long term. Pennings, remarkably, in new home designs, we're stacking closets, framing them for elevators way before you need them. It's just thinking ahead. You don't need an elevator, but let's stack these closets so that future use can do that. Universal design. You don't see it, but it's there. It might not be for that homeowner, but what about the next homeowner? The realtors in the house, they're going to appreciate that because now guess what? That market is opened up to a lot more people than just a certain demographic, okay? I had this idea, and matter of fact, this is the first, I stayed at the hotel last night, and I couldn't get off the toilet. And I haven't sat on a standard height toilet in a long time. I was shocked. My knees were like up to my chin. I'm thinking, wow, it was weird. Think about this. Why are we changing toilets out to ADA height toilets? I can't tell you how many we do a month. Why don't we have a standard height toilet that has 3 rings to the toilet seat so that the kids can touch their feet on the floor with a standard height ring, a comfort height ring for you and I, a ADA height ring for when my grandparents come and visit? Why are we changing these toilets out? Why can't we develop a product that will do that? Matter of fact, my patent attorney is working on that right now, so I'll let you know how that works out. That's how we need to start thinking. That's what's going to change. That butterfly effect is in place. Okay? I've got to tell you a couple stories because it's really important to what I do and why I do this. I had a lady call. She said, I need a ramp. Come to the house. Help. I show up. We're at the front of the house, and she's really concerned about the look that this is going to be on her house. She's a senior, aging in place, and I'm noticing she doesn't have a wheelchair. And I asked her, I said, why do you need a ramp? She goes, well, really, I can't lift my foot more than 4 or 5 inches. And so the steps are getting harder for me. I said, honey, why don't we just build steps that have 4 or 5 inch risers? I'll put it in a 5x5 landing so that if someday you do need a ramp, we can take the steps off and put a ramp on so that it has the landing already there. But let's just change the rise of the stairs. She started to cry. She said, David, you've kept my dignity. You listened to what I needed. You didn't just put a ramp on my house. You kept my dignity. We're working with a gentleman that was in an automobile accident, and the insurance company's involved, and going through this project, they missed the fact that the electrical panel he won't be able to reach anymore. We got to move that down. They missed the fact that even though we put a chairlift downstairs, through either elevator or a chair to the basement, he physically can't get to the corner of the house where the water meter is to turn the water off if there's a plumbing problem. So I found an electronic water valve that he can run from his iPhone. Well, he can turn the water off anywhere in the house, well, anywhere in the world, actually. But now that technology is in the house, I can shut the blinds, I can turn the lights off, and I can lock the front door. I've got a gentleman that's a senior that's living at home. his kids are out of town and out of state, and they're concerned about their dad living at home. So we put in a bed sensor. The bed sensor, if he gets out of bed at night, turns the light on in the bedroom, down the hall, into the bath, and into the kitchen. When he goes back to bed, turns the lights off. The number one reason somebody has to leave their house is a slip and fall accident. We've got to prevent that slip and fall accident. What does it mean? What does it cost? I don't know. What does it cost to be in a nursing home? What does it cost to not be able to get back home? So in addition to that sensor, now that that technology is in place, if he's not back in bed in 30 minutes, his kids get a text. His kids can look. There's cameras in the house. They can look. Dad, are you all right? If they have to have EMS come, they can unlock the door from wherever they're at so the EMS doesn't have to kick the door in. There's technologies out there that we're incorporating into the designs to make the home functional, safe, and the biggest word that I can use is peace of mind. I got a lady that has MS. Her husband was caring for her. They're using a Hoyer lift. We had to change the bathroom, put in a curbless shower, which it's an amazing product because you take the subfloor down to the floor joist, and the pan sits in there. It's all tapered, so it's truly a roll-in, walk-in shower. So it's going to help him with the Hoyer to take the stress off of him, caregiving for his wife. And we put a window in the bathroom and did some really fun things just to make the space brighter, more fun. I mean, she's always wanted a window, and now she does. So we have this new space, and as I'm walking out of the house, end of the project, she grabs me and pulls me down, and she says, "David, you've taken some of my handicap away." Purpose. Finally, purpose in my life, a passion for what I do, passion for who I help. We can change the world. And how do we do that? One house at a time.
So, these were really great presentations. They have an amazing mix of humor. Who knew disability was funny? But it is. By the way, there's several cases out there in which a failure to remove snow has been challenged through a complaint because snow removal was requested as a reasonable accommodation, and it was not done because of the kind of reasons we heard about. I thought it was interesting that we heard that from several different perspectives. We've got a combination of, well, you have to know what the law is, right? But there's a sensibility about dealing with people with disabilities. Notice I said sensibility. It's not just the rigid rules. It is listening. It is addressing the actual concerns. It is not basing your action on stereotypes or assumptions. I once, at HUD, someone wrote, a housing provider funded by HUD wrote HUD and said, "Dear HUD, we do not wish to accept any more paranoid schizophrenics in our property. We had one and it was a problem." You want to talk about a stereotype or an assumption, right? I mean, first of all, they put it in writing to their funding agency. Yes, they did get into trouble. Yes, that was a little stupid. But it also suggests the kind of stereotyped assumptions that we have historically had as a society about other categories of discrimination as well, have we not? Race. All black people are alike. But we don't think like that anymore, do we? Or the case, there were issues that we work with right now at HUD in another area, in lending discrimination, where the assumption is that because a woman is pregnant and on maternity leave, she is not eligible for a loan because she will not go back to work after she has the kid. I have not known a single woman in the last 10 years who has not gone back to work after she had the kid. Okay, maybe sometimes 3 months and sometimes 6 weeks and sometimes 6 months, but they go back to work. It's assumptions and stereotypes. You have to get beyond that and look the person in the eye and see what the needs are. I do want to, we're going to take a break just momentarily. I do want to draw your attention to one particular aspect of the law that didn't quite get hit. So David's exactly right. Neither the ADA nor the Fair Housing Act require single-family houses to be built accessible. Two caveats. One, if you set up a model single-family house or an office, like at a subdivision that you're building, and it's the place where people go in to do their sales routines, you know, it's all fully fixed up, but it's also the model home, and you have a salesperson sitting in the living room with a desk and brochures who will show people around, so forth and so on. That particular model home, or perhaps it's a construction office or whatever it is, has to be accessible. Do you know why? Because it was built and is being used as a public accommodation, because sales operations are going on there. So a real estate office that serves the public has to be accessible under ADA, right? And so does the on-site model single-family house that's being used as the selling technique to get people to buy a lot and build their own houses. Not widely known, but there is case law on it. The second thing I'll just mention, then we'll take a break, is under the law, if you're building an apartment building or a condo and you have 4 or more units in that building, under federal law and under state law, you have to build in certain levels of accessibility. Just as David said, it's multifamily, not single family. Fair Housing Act requires this, not the ADA. And as David says, being off even 1/2 an inch or an inch is the difference between accessibility / usability and not. And so new construction, multifamily, has to comply with Fair Housing Act design and construction requirements. It's not full accessibility. It's not individual needs accessibility either. It's not grab bars in the bathroom. It's studs in the wall in the bathroom so someone can install grab bars at the height they need them or at the place they need them when they come in. It is flat entrances. It is no steps. It is wider doors. It doesn't look accessible. And it's somewhere in between that 504 handicap unit that has the grab bars and, you know, if you look closely, you can see it's accessible. Somewhere between that, because these units don't really look accessible. And on the other end of the spectrum, universal design, which is design sensibility, not just meeting the needs of the individual. And so we have a whole spectrum of physical access models that we're looking at here. And some are legally required, and others are very focused on the meeting of the needs of the individual.